Did you hear me? I have one last thing to say. By one last scout. Trigger warning. Major character death. One day later. The aftermath was awful. The reporters got a hold of Izuku's death, and the internet had gone insane. More and more stories of the quirkless being abused had come out, and were being treated seriously. Everyone was mourning the loss of Verdan. It was painful, upsetting, and brought out so many truths to people's eyes. Heroes were under fire for not saving him in time, some more than others. All Might and Endeavor were getting the most of the heat, considering what was said. Keigo had thrown himself into work and training, trying to save as many people as he could. He wasn't fast enough. He couldn't save the kid. He couldn't save Izuku. He shook his head and focused on the mission at hand. It was a rescue situation. A car had flipped into the bridge. He sent his feathers to get the couple out of the car. He set them down gently on the pavement and took off again, avoiding the reporters. He hadn't bothered calling the commission or picking up their calls. He had failed Izuku, and he would make up for it. He'd never be too slow again. Hisashi winced as his bloodied knuckles hit the bag again. He needed a way to get out all of his emotions before he accidentally started an argument with Shota. They had both been devastated by Izuku's death. Since the little listener's parents were both dead, they were going to cremate him. They'd get his ashes and probably find somewhere to spread them. I should have saved him. Should have been quicker. He hit the punching bag again. There was a crack in his hand and he winced. He had to get that checked by a recovery girl. He walked out of the UA gym, feeling slightly better, but his heart was still heavy with what could have happened. He shouldn't have relied solely on Hawks and Shota. He should have done something. He could still hear the crunch. He died with a smile. He looked so peaceful, so happy. He shouldn't have been so happy to take his own life. He was just a kid. Just a kid. Hisashi snapped back into reality when he was in front of Recovery Girl's office. He finally sighed and walked in. He had made a promise to himself. He'd never rely too much on one person anymore. Shota had been awake for hours, but he didn't think he could leave the bed. He had too much going on in his head, too many thoughts, regrets, emotions. He was paralyzed by them. He wasn't strong enough. He couldn't save his kid, just like he couldn't save Oboro. Shota felt the wetness dampen his face. He sobbed silently as he thought of the surprise on the kid's face when he tilted back. Shota was taken by shock and didn't react quick enough to catch him. He made a mistake and Izuku paid for it. It was his fault. It was his fault and he needed to do better, to be better. He'd be stronger. To say All for One was furious was an understatement. He had saved the Airy girl and he would have been able to save his son if not for the blonde bimbo thinking he saw him. He had to hide when he saw him. He had hoped the heroes would be able to save his son, but he should have known better. He had lost his wife and son on the same day. At least he had Airy. He would do right by her, make her the happiest girl in the world. He'd do better. He had left Airy and Airy with Kurogiri. Kurogiri and Tomura. They had been surprised to see his face again, but didn't question him too much. He guessed he hadn't been able to keep the grief off his face as well as he hoped. Not that it mattered. He had plans to make. He would be pulling all the strings. Everyone who hurt his kid would pay. He'd get his revenge on behalf of Izuku. 1 month later. Keiko sighed. He was the number one hero now. All Might and Endeavor had been killed by All for One in the famous last battle. There it was revealed that All for One was Midoriya Hisashi. That was a shock to everyone. Either way, everyone saw it was a father getting revenge for his son and wife. They stood for All for One, making crime rates spike to an all-out high. People didn't believe in heroes anymore. It was terrible. Keigo focused back on his paperwork. He needed to get this done, then get back on patrol. Just because Japan was going downhill doesn't mean he can slack off. He'd gotten to a new level of fast in a month. But it wasn't good enough. He needed to get faster, needed to be better. He dropped the pen and went to his balcony. He spread his wings and took off. Paperwork could wait. People needed him. Hisashi walked the halls of UA greeting students in signature present mic persona. The minute he walked into the teacher's lounge, he dropped the smile and let tension back into his shoulders. He sat on the couch and looked up at the ceiling and thought, it's been a month, and so much had happened. Apparently, All Might had made a fatal mistake telling the son of the world's greatest supervillain that he couldn't be a hero, and Endeavor made the fatal mistake of killing his wife. Bakugo Katsuki had been arrested for manslaughter. His trial would be one of the biggest in Japan. All for One was practically running Japan now. Everyone stood with him. Hisashi doesn't think he can blame him for killing the two top heroes. He might have done it himself. He sighed and went back to his office. He hadn't been allowed to go back to the gym since he kept on going until he broke his wrist every single time. He might as well begin early on grades. His students needed him. Shota had expelled his entire class again. They didn't have the potential from refusing to use the full extent of their quirks to goofing off. You can't blame them for your mistakes. He was going over his statement for the Bakugo Katsuki case. The kid was going to be the face of the quirkless discrimination case. He was still just a kid, but Shota couldn't help but feel a little resentment toward him. Shota shook his head and continued the statement. No one needed him right now anyway. All for One was going over some business plans with some of his subunits when Kurogiri teleported with a crying Eri in his arms. It was late, so he guessed it was another nightmare. He took the girl in his arms and hugged her closely. He had gotten his revenge on All Might and Endeavor, even though he had lost one for all. He felt better about killing the two that killed his son and wife, no matter how indirect it was. He wasn't going to kill Katsuki. He felt that the press dragging the brat through the mud would be better than anything he would do. He was brought out. Yeah, I'm recording. He was brought out of his thoughts by one of his lackeys clearing their throat, and continued speaking. Eri was asleep now. He smiled softly at her and focused back on the conversation at hand. He would give her the world on a platter. Eri needed him right now. 1 year later. It was the anniversary of Izuku's death. Keigo had decided to take the day off. More like was forced to by Mirko and Best Jeanist. He hadn't really taken a break since before his death. He couldn't relax when there were people that needed him. He wouldn't be too slow to save anyone ever again. He sighed as he picked up his ringing phone. It was President Mike. He held it up to his ear as he boiled the water for his instant ramen. "Hawks," he said gruffly. "Hey, it's Mike. I was thinking that you, me, and Eraser could get together for a drink night. I think we were hit hardest by what happened that day." He trailed off and thought. Keiko thought for a moment before he decided. "Yeah, I have nothing better to do. Just send me the address. Bye." He hung up before he heard the reply. As he was cleaning up around the house, he noticed a letter on his table. On it was his name, sent by Izuku. He didn't open it. He would take it with him to the bar. He wonders how it got in his house. All for One didn't owe the heroes anything. They had failed to save his son, after all. Then again, he failed his son too. He had already gotten his closure, though. They deserved theirs. People think he's just a heartless killer, but he has never killed anyone that didn't deserve it. He hadn't even killed the Katsuki. After he was convicted for 30 years, death would have been too easy. All for One brought his attention to the picture of Inko, him, and Izuku. It was one of his favorites. It was before he had left to protect them. He can't help what might have happened if he stayed. He sighed. It did hurt. It will always hurt. But it's in the past. He loved Eri and Tomura with all his heart, and he would be okay. He would move on. Hopefully the letters help the heroes move on too. They had gotten a few drinks in them before they settled down to read the letter. Normally, with a strange letter showing up at a hero's house. But they couldn't bring themselves to care. It was a spark of hope that maybe the letter could help the three. Maybe it would help Shota's depression and self-guilt. Maybe it helped Hizashi's emotional detachment and unhealthy habits. Maybe it would help Hawk's hyper-focus on work and self-destruction, or it might make it worse. They all readied themselves as they opened the letter. As they went their separate ways, they thought over the letter. Hisashi promised he would take care of himself and not harm himself anymore. Shota promised he would do better and actually teach the next generation instead of judging them harshly. Hawks promised he would still save as many people, but make sure he wouldn't overdo it. They would live their lives and make sure Izuku can live through them. They could do this. They wouldn't let him down. They would be their best. They would feel their best. Shota, Kego, and Hisashi had heard Midoriya Izuku loud and clear. Dear readers, I'm surprised you're reading this, honestly. I guess it means I'm dead for real. Either way, thank you. I had to go through a lot of hoops to make sure this letter got to the person or people who really cared. I'm sorry I left you behind. I just couldn't take it anymore. It was too much, too painful. There's a chance no one is reading this and no one actually cared. It doesn't matter, does it? I just want to say this. If anyone, any of the people or person that care about my death got hurt, I would be upset. I'm not sure if there is heaven or whatever, but please take care of yourselves. Move on. Be happy. I don't know if I said this to you, but I love you. All of you. Or one of them. I really don't know how I'd imagine people find how I'd imagine to find people that cared, but thank you. Goodbye. For one last time. Love, Izuku. That is the end of part 2 of Just Let It Be Heard. Thank you for listening.